Good evening, and welcome back to Mythic Dreamscapes. Tonight we journey north beyond the familiar shores of the Mediterranean, beyond the sun-baked temples of Greece and Rome, into lands where ice and fire first collided to birth the world. We travel to the realm of Norse mythology, to the stories whispered by Viking storytellers around crackling hearth fires, preserved in ancient manuscripts written by medieval scholars who sought to save the old tales before they vanished like morning mist. As always, let me know where in the world you are listening from. Get comfortable, settle in, and let us begin. The gods we encounter tonight are not distant, perfect beings removed from mortal concerns. They are warriors who know they will one day fall, sages who sacrifice their own flesh for knowledge, tricksters who blur the line between friend and foe. These are gods who bleed, who laugh, who love and betray. The Norse pantheon tells us not of eternal paradise, but of a cosmos balanced on the edge of a blade, where even the mightiest must one day face their doom. At the heart of this mythology stand two tribes of gods, the Æsir and the Vanir. The Æsir, dwelling in golden Asgard, embody war, rulership, and cosmic order. The Vanir, residing in fertile Vanaheim, represent prosperity, magic, and the turning of seasons. Though they once fought a terrible war against each other, these divine families would eventually unite, their combined strength holding back the forces of chaos until the inevitable end of all things. Among them towers Odin the Allfather, one-eyed seeker of forbidden knowledge, master of runes and wanderer of worlds. Beside him stands his son Thor, thunder god and giant slayer, wielder of the hammer Mjolnir, beloved by common folk and feared by the enemies of order. And among the Vanir shine Freyja, goddess of love and battle, and her brother Freyr, bringer of peace and plenty, along with their father Njord, lord of sea and wind. Tonight, we will trace the threads of their stories from the very beginning of time, when nothing existed but ice and flame, to the prophesied end at Ragnarök, when gods and giants will meet in final battle and the world itself will burn and be reborn. These tales shaped the Viking Age, influenced medieval culture, and continue to resonate in our modern world through countless adaptations and retellings. So dim the lights, quiet your mind, and prepare yourself. We stand now at the threshold of the Norse cosmos, ready to walk among gods and giants, to witness the forging of legendary weapons and the weaving of inescapable fate. The journey begins not with creation as a divine command, but with collision, with the meeting of opposites in a void beyond imagining. Before there were gods, before there was earth or sky, sea or stars, there existed only the void. The Norse called it Ginnungagap, the yawning emptiness, a gap so vast and dark that even to speak its name was to acknowledge the terror of nothingness. Ginnungagap was not merely empty space, it was absence itself, the place before place, the time before time began its counting. To the north of this void lay Niflheim, the world of ice, mist and frost. 11 rivers flowed from the spring called Hvergelmir at Niflheim's heart, rivers whose waters turned to venom and ice as they poured into the void. Layer upon layer of frost built up in the northern reaches of Ginnungagap, poisonous rime that crackled and groaned in the eternal cold. To the south burned Muspelheim, the realm of fire, a world of molten rock and raging flame. At its border stood the fire giant Surtur, ancient beyond measure, wielding a sword of flame that would one day set the cosmos ablaze. Heat poured from Muspelheim into the southern portion of Ginnungagap, sparks flying like angry stars into the darkness. For ages unmeasured, ice and fire remained separate, two extremes divided by emptiness, but slowly, inexorably, they crept toward each other. The heat from Muspelheim began to reach across the void toward the ice of Niflheim. When that searing heat met the frozen rime, something miraculous occurred. The ice began to melt, dripping and flowing, and in that place where fire and frost combined, where heat met cold in perfect balance, life emerged. The first being to take form was Ymir, the primordial giant. He was vast beyond comprehension, described in the sources as hermaphroditic, containing within himself the potential for all the giants who would come after. As Ymir slept in that twilight space between ice and flame, he began to sweat. From the sweat of his left armpit emerged a male and female giant. One of his legs bred with the other, producing a six-headed son. Thus the race of frost giants, the Jotnar, came into being, born from the body of their ancestor without conscious effort or intent. This unusual mode of reproduction reflects the undifferentiated nature of primordial creation, where the distinctions that would later define reality had not yet been established. But Ymir was not alone in that newborn space. From the melting ice emerged another creature, Audhumla, a cosmic cow of enormous proportions. 4 rivers of milk flowed from her udders, and these nourished Ymir and gave him strength. The cow herself required sustenance, and she found it in the salty ice blocks that filled Ginnungagap. As Ymir drank her milk, Audhumla licked at the frozen salt. On the first day of her licking, hair emerged from the ice. On the second day, a head appeared. On the third day, an entire man stood free, released from his frozen prison. This was Buri, the first of the gods, beautiful and strong beyond measure. By some means not recorded in the surviving tales, Buri produced a son named Bor. And Bor took as his wife the giantess Bestla, daughter of a giant named Bolthorn, and together they had 3 sons who would change everything: Odin, Vili, and Ve. These 3 brothers, the first of the Æsir, looked out upon the forming world and saw that it was chaotic, shapeless, dominated by the ever-growing numbers of frost giants spawned from Ymir's restless body. The giants were not evil in the way we might understand evil, but they represented raw, uncontrolled natural forces, avalanches and blizzards, destructive power without purpose or pattern. The brothers understood that if order was to exist, if life as we know it was to flourish, something had to change. So Odin, Vili, and Ve made a terrible decision. They attacked Ymir as he slept and slew him. The primordial giant's death was cataclysmic. So much blood poured from his wounds that it became a great flood, drowning nearly all the frost giants in a deluge of gore. Only 2 survived: a giant named Bergelmir and his wife, who escaped in a boat made from a hollowed tree trunk, what the sources call a lure. From these 2, all future generations of Jotnar would descend, and they would remember forever the murder of their ancestor, nurturing an eternal enmity toward the gods. The 3 brothers took Ymir's immense corpse and dragged it to the center of Ginnungagap. From his body they would fashion the world. His blood became the seas, the oceans, the lakes and rivers that would nourish all life. His flesh became the earth itself, rich soil from which plants would grow. His bones they broke and shaped into mountains that rose toward the sky. His teeth and smaller bone fragments became rocks and stones scattered across the land. His hair became the trees and all the vegetation that would clothe the earth in green. What happened to Vili and Ve after this act of creation remains unclear in the surviving sources. They fade from the myths, appearing in the creation story, but rarely mentioned afterward. This could suggest they merged with Odin's identity, or simply that later storytellers focused on Odin as the supreme deity. Scholars have debated whether they represent aspects of Odin himself or were once independent gods whose worship declined over time. From Ymir's enormous skull, the brothers created the dome of the heavens. They set it up and placed 4 dwarves at the cardinal points to hold it steady. These dwarves were named Ostri, east, Vestri, west, Nordri, north, and Sudri, south, and they bore the sky upon their shoulders so it would not fall. The gods took sparks and embers from Muspelheim and flung them into the sky to create the stars, giving light to the newly formed world. Ymir's brains they scattered across the heavens, and these became the clouds that would drift across the sky, bringing rain to the earth. Even his eyebrows found purpose, formed into a great wall that would separate and protect the inner realm of Midgard, where humans would one day live, from the outer lands of Jotunheim, where the vengeful giants dwelt. At the center of all creation, connecting every realm, grew Yggdrasil, the world tree. Whether it emerged from Ymir's body or grew from the primordial mixture of ice and fire, the sources do not clearly tell us. But there it stood, a mighty ash tree of such size that its branches reached beyond the highest heavens, and its roots delved into the deepest places of existence. Yggdrasil was not merely a tree, but the axis of reality itself, the backbone of the cosmos. The tree had 3 great roots. One extended into Asgard, where it drew water from the well of Erd, tended by the 3 Norns, the weavers of fate, who determined the destiny of gods and men alike. The second root reached into Jotunheim, where it was nourished by the well of Mimir, source of all wisdom. The third route stretched down into Niflheim, to the spring Vergelmir, where it was constantly gnawed by the dragon Nidhogg, who sought to destroy the tree from below. Upon Yggdrasil's branches and in its roots dwelt many creatures. An eagle perched at the very top, and between its eyes sat a hawk named Vedrfolnir. 4 stags ran among the branches, nibbling at the bark and leaves: Dain, Dvalin, Dunair, and Durathror. A squirrel named Ratatosk scurried up and down the trunk, carrying insults between the eagle above and Nidhogg below, stirring up discord and ensuring that the tree remained in constant turmoil. Despite the damage it endured, Yggdrasil stood eternal, holding the structure of reality together through its own endurance. Around Yggdrasil, the gods established 9 worlds, arranged in 3 levels among the tree's roots and branches, though the exact list of these 9 varies somewhat between sources. In the highest reaches sat Asgard, home of the Æsir gods, a realm of golden halls and mighty fortresses connected to the other worlds by Bifrost, the Rainbow Bridge, which was guarded by the ever-watchful god Heimdall. Nearby was Vanaheim, home of the Vanir gods, a realm associated with fertility and natural magic. Also in the upper level was Alfheim, realm of the Light Elves, beings of beauty and grace. In the middle level sat Midgard, the world of humans, surrounded by the protective wall made from Ymir's eyebrows. Connected to it was Jotunheim, the realm of the giants, a harsh land of mountains, forests, and frozen wastes. Also on this level was Svartalfheim, sometimes called Nidavellir, home of the dwarves, master craftsmen who dwelt in caves and halls beneath the mountains, forging wondrous objects in their underground forges. In the lowest level lay Niflheim, the realm of ice and mist where it had all begun. Within or connected to Niflheim was Helheim, the realm of the dead, ruled by Hel, daughter of Loki. And there too remained Muspelheim, the fire realm, where Surtur waited with his flaming sword for the end of days. Some sources count Muspelheim and Niflheim as existing before the 9 worlds were established, making the exact configuration a matter of interpretation. The gods walked upon the newly made earth and found 2 pieces of driftwood lying on a beach, washed up by the sea. The sources describe these as 2 trees or tree trunks, lifeless but beautiful in their natural form. Odin, Vili, and Ve looked upon them and decided to create from these simple pieces of wood a new race of beings. They gave them shape and form. Odin breathed into them spirit and life. Vili granted them intelligence and the power of movement. Ve gave them the ability to see, hear, and speak, and clothed them in appearance. Thus were born Ask and Embla, the first man and first woman ancestors of all humankind. The gods placed them in Midgard, gave them the earth to inhabit, and the fruits of the land to sustain them. And from these 2, the race of humans would spread across the world, building their halls, telling their stories, and worshipping the gods who had shaped them from wood and breath. The cosmos now had structure. The 9 worlds, connected by Yggdrasil, each housed their own inhabitants. Gods in their high halls, giants in their mountain strongholds, dwarves in their underground kingdoms, elves in their ethereal realm, and humans in the middle world caught between all the others. But the structure was not stable. Tension existed from the very beginning. The gods and giants would forever be at odds, connected by marriage and alliance, yet divided by ancient bloodshed. And among the gods themselves, 2 tribes would emerge with different values and different visions for how the cosmos should be ordered. The stage was set. The players had taken their places. Now the great drama of Norse mythology could truly begin. Among all the Norse gods, none is more complex, more contradictory, or more powerful than Odin. He was called by countless names: Allfather, Grimnir, Har, Jafnhar, Thrid, Bolverk, Ygg, and so many others that merely reciting them would take considerable time. Each name revealed a different aspect of his nature, for Odin was not a god who could be easily understood or simply described. He was god of war and wisdom, of poetry and death, of magic and madness. He was king of the Æsir, ruler of Asgard, father of many gods and heroes, yet he was also a wanderer who roamed the 9 worlds in disguise, a seeker who sacrificed everything in his endless pursuit of knowledge. Odin's appearance was striking and unmistakable. Ancient sources describe him as a tall old man with a flowing beard, often grey or white with age. Most distinctive was his single piercing eye. Where his right eye should have been, there was only an empty socket, for Odin had sacrificed that eye in his quest for wisdom. He typically wore a broad-brimmed hat pulled low over his face, and a dark blue or grey cloak that swirled around him like storm clouds. In his hand he carried Gungnir, a spear that never missed its mark, forged by the sons of Ivaldi, the same dwarven craftsmen who created treasures for other gods. Odin rode upon Sleipnir, an 8-legged horse faster than any other steed in all the 9 worlds. Sleipnir was actually Odin's grandson, born of Loki in mare form and the mighty stallion Svadilfari, but that is a tale of its own. This incredible horse could gallop through the air and across the seas, carry Odin between worlds, and even ride down into Helheim, the realm of the dead, where ordinary horses could not go. 2 ravens accompanied Odin wherever he went, Hugin and Munin, whose names meant thought and memory. Each morning these ravens flew forth from Asgard, soaring across all the 9 worlds, seeing everything that transpired. Each evening they returned to perch upon Odin's shoulders and whisper into his ears all they had witnessed. Through them, Odin gained knowledge of events throughout the cosmos. Ancient poetry records Odin's words. Hugin and Munin fly each day over the spacious earth. I fear for Hugin, lest he come not home, but I watch more anxiously for Munin. Some scholars interpret this as Odin's fear of losing not just information, but the capacity for thought and memory itself. Odin also kept 2 wolves, Geri and Freki, whose names both meant the greedy one or the ravenous one. These wolves sat beside him in Valhalla, his great hall in Asgard, and he fed them all the meat from his table, for Odin himself required no food. He subsisted entirely on wine, needing no other sustenance to maintain his divine existence. But for all his power and majesty, Odin was defined most by his hunger for knowledge. Unlike many supreme gods who rest content in their omniscience, Odin knew he did not know everything, and this drove him to extreme lengths. He understood that knowledge was power, that wisdom was the key to postponing the inevitable, that only by learning the secrets of the cosmos might he have any hope of surviving Ragnarök, the doom of the gods. The tale of how Odin lost his eye demonstrates the lengths he would go to for wisdom. At the base of Yggdrasil, where one of its 3 roots reached into Jotunheim, there was a well called Mimisbrunner, the Well of Mimir. This well contained the waters of wisdom, knowledge of past, present, and future, understanding of the secrets hidden at the foundation of reality. The well was guarded by Mimir, a being of immense wisdom, possibly himself a god, or perhaps a giant. Odin journeyed to the well and asked Mimir for a drink of its waters. Mimir, knowing the value of what he guarded, demanded a terrible price: one of Odin's eyes. Many might have turned away at such a cost, for what is a god's sight worth? But Odin did not hesitate. He plucked out his own eye and cast it into the well, where it sank to the bottom, forever gazing upward at the world it would never see again. In exchange, Mimir allowed him to drink, and the knowledge Odin gained from that single drink transformed him, gave him insight into the workings of fate, the nature of the runes, and the coming of Ragnarök. Years later, during the Æsir Vanir War, Mimir would be sent as a hostage to the Vanir, and eventually beheaded by them when they felt deceived. But Odin retrieved his old friend's severed head, embalmed it with herbs, and spoke charms over it, so that it came back to a sort of life. From then on, Mimir's head served as Odin's most trusted advisor, speaking prophecy and wisdom whenever Odin needed counsel in difficult matters. But Odin's quest for knowledge did not end at Mimir's well. The greatest source of magical power in the Norse cosmos was the runic alphabet, mysterious symbols that were not merely letters, but sources of power, each one containing within itself a portion of cosmic understanding. The runes existed in the worlds before anyone had discovered them, and their secrets were hidden from gods and mortals alike. To gain the knowledge of the runes, Odin performed a terrible self-sacrifice. He took Gungnir, his own spear, and pierced himself through. Then he hanged himself from one of Yggdrasil's branches, dangling in agony for 9 days and 9 nights. He ordered the other gods not to aid him in any way, not to give him even a drop of water. There he hung, wounded and dying, staring down into the abyss below the tree, neither fully alive nor fully dead. Old Norse poetry preserves Odin's own account of this ordeal. "I know that I hung on a windy tree, 9 long nights wounded with a spear, dedicated to Odin, myself to myself. In this state between life and death, with his divine consciousness stretched to its limits, he finally saw what he sought. At the end of the 9th night screaming, he perceived the runes at last. They revealed themselves to him in that moment of ultimate sacrifice, and he grasped them, drawing them up from the depths. The knowledge of the runes gave Odin mastery over magic and the ability to see into the workings of fate. Each rune represented not just a sound or letter, but a concept, a force, a key to understanding reality. With the runes, Odin could heal the sick, calm storms, turn weapons against his attackers, wake the dead to question them, and perform countless other acts of magic. He taught the runes to gods and to certain humans, spreading this knowledge through the world, though he kept the deepest secrets for himself. Odin was also intimately connected with death and warfare. He was not a god of glorious battle in the way his son Thor was. While Thor protected both gods and humans with his straightforward strength, Odin's relationship with war was more complex and more sinister. He was called the father of the slain, and it was said he stirred up conflicts between kingdoms just so warriors would die in battle and come to him. For Odin dwelt in Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, the greatest of all halls in Asgard. Its roof was made of shields, and spears formed its rafters. Its doors were wide enough for 800 warriors to march through abreast. Here Odin gathered the Einherjar, warriors who died with weapons in their hands, chosen from the battlefields by the Valkyries, Odin's warrior women who served as his divine handmaidens. The Valkyries, whose name meant choosers of the slain, rode through the sky on flying horses, appearing at battlefields to select which warriors would die and which would live. Those they chose for death and deemed worthy were brought to Valhalla, where they feasted each night on the meat of the boar Saeirimnir, which was cooked fresh every day and came back to life each night so it could be slaughtered and eaten again. They drank mead that flowed from the udders of the goat Hydron, who stood atop Valhalla nibbling at the leaves of Yggdrasil. Each day, the Einherjar would fight each other in the courtyard, dying and being resurrected, honing their skills for the final battle to come. For Odin knew what awaited him. The knowledge he had gained at such terrible cost had shown him Ragnarök, the twilight of the gods, when the forces of chaos would break free from their bonds and make war upon Asgard. Odin knew that he himself would die in that battle, swallowed by the monstrous wolf Fenrir. Everything he did, every warrior he gathered, every scheme he plotted, was aimed at postponing that doom, or perhaps surviving it somehow. He was a king, haunted by the future, desperately preparing for a battle he knew he could not win. This knowledge made Odin unpredictable, and sometimes cruel. He played favorites among human kings and heroes, granting them victory for a time, and then betraying them when it suited his purposes. He broke oaths, used deception, and manipulated both gods and mortals. Yet he was also capable of great wisdom and generosity. He gave gifts to those he favored, weapons that never failed, advice that brought victory, poetry that would echo through the ages. For Odin was god of poetry as well as war and wisdom. He had stolen the mead of poetry from the giants in one of his many adventures. This mead, brewed from the blood of Kvasir, the wisest being ever created, granted the gift of eloquence to anyone who drank it. Odin kept it in Asgard and dispensed it to those he deemed worthy, creating the skalds, the poets, whose verses preserved the old stories and honored the gods and heroes. Odin was also a practitioner of Saga, a form of Norse magic particularly associated with women and the Vanir gods. Saga involved prophecy, shape-changing, and manipulating the threads of fate. For a male god, especially the king of the Æsir, to practice Saga was considered somewhat shameful by Viking Age standards, for it was deemed unmanly. But Odin cared nothing for such conventions. He learned Saga from Freyja, the Vanir goddess, and used it to gain advantages over his enemies and insight into the future. In his journeys through the 9 worlds, Odin often traveled in disguise. He would appear as an old wanderer, his hat pulled low over his missing eye, leaning on his staff. In this guise, he would visit the halls of kings and test their hospitality, or question giants and dwarves to gain their knowledge. Many tales tell of Odin engaging in contests of wisdom with various beings, wagering his head that he could answer any question or pose riddles that could not be solved. Odin was father to many children by various mothers. With his wife Frigg, he had Balder, the beautiful god whose death would be one of the signs of Ragnarök's approach. With the giantess Njord, the personification of earth, he fathered Thor, who would become one of the most beloved gods in the Norse pantheon. With the giantess Rinda, he had Vali, who would avenge Balder's death. With Grid, another giantess, he fathered Vidar, the silent god who would survive Ragnarök and avenge Odin himself by slaying Fenrir. The sources suggest Odin had many other children as well, though the details of their mothers and stories have not all survived. Though Odin was called Allfather and was revered as king of the gods, worship of him during the Viking Age was not as widespread as one might expect. He was the god of kings and nobles, of poets and berserker warriors, of those who sought wisdom or practiced magic. Common farmers and fishermen more often turned to Thor for protection or to Freyr for good harvests. Odin was too unpredictable, too dangerous, too likely to demand ultimate sacrifices from those who followed him. Yet in the surviving literature, Odin dominates. He is the central figure of the Norse pantheon, the one whose actions drive the great stories forward. From the creation of the world with his brothers to his preparations for Ragnarök. From his gathering of the slain to his endless pursuit of knowledge, Odin shaped the fate of gods and men. He remains one of the most fascinating figures in all of mythology. A god who knows he will die, who sacrifices everything in the hope of changing or at least understanding his fate, who embodies both the highest wisdom and the darkest cunning. In the end, Odin stands as a reminder that even the gods are not all-powerful, that knowledge comes with terrible costs, and that sometimes the price of wisdom is worth paying, even when you know the knowledge you gain will not save you from your doom. If Odin was the mind of the Æsir pantheon, complex and cunning, then Thor was its might, straightforward and powerful. Where Odin schemed and manipulated, Thor acted with directness and honesty. Where Odin gathered warriors for a battle he knew was coming, Thor fought every day to protect both gods and humans from the forces of chaos. Among all the Norse gods, Thor was perhaps the most beloved by the common people, for he was their protector, the thunder god who stood between the ordered world and the destructive powers of the giants. Thor was the son of Odin and Njord, the personified earth. This parentage linked him intimately to both the divine realm and the natural world. Unlike his father, Thor was not slender and wise, but massive and powerful, with a full red beard and eyes that flashed like lightning. His voice was thunder itself, booming across the heavens when he spoke. His appetite was legendary, capable of eating an entire ox at a single sitting, and his thirst matched it, drinking barrels of mead without slowing. In many ways, Thor embodied the hearty Viking ideal, strong, brave, straightforward, with little patience for deception or clever words. Thor dwelt in Bilskirnir, his hall in Asgard, which was the largest building in any of the 9 worlds with 540 rooms. He was married to Sif, a goddess renowned for her beautiful golden hair that flowed like ripened wheat, symbolizing the fertility of the fields. Together they had a daughter named Thrud, whose name meant strength, and Thor also had 2 sons, Magni, mighty, and Modi, brave, who would survive Ragnarök and inherit their father's hammer in the new world to come. But Thor's most famous possession was not a child or a hall, but his weapon, Mjolnir, a hammer of such power that it became the most famous symbol in Norse mythology. Mjolnir's creation began, like so many Norse tales, with an act of mischief by Loki. The trickster god, in a moment of characteristic poor judgment, had cut off all of Sif's beautiful golden hair while she slept. When Thor discovered this, his rage was terrible. He seized Loki and threatened to break every bone in his body unless the trickster could somehow restore Sif's hair. Terrified, Loki fled to Svartalfheim, the realm of the dwarves, seeking out the sons of Ivaldi, master craftsmen renowned throughout the 9 worlds. These dwarves agreed to help, and they forged not only new hair for Sif from pure gold that would attach and grow like real hair, but also created the ship Skidbladnir, which could fold up to fit in one's pocket and always had favorable winds, and Gungnir, the spear that would become Odin's prized possession. Pleased with these treasures but eager for more mischief, Loki then approached two other dwarven brothers, Brokkr and Eitri, who was also called Sindri. Loki wagered his own head that these brothers could not create three treasures equal in magnificence to those the sons of Ivaldi had forged. The brothers accepted the challenge. First, Eitri placed pigskin in the forge and instructed his brother to pump the bellows without stopping, no matter what happened. Loki, desperate to win his wager, transformed himself into a fly and began biting Brokkr's hand, trying to make him stop. But Brokkr continued pumping, and from the forge emerged Gullinbursti, a golden boar whose bristles glowed in the dark and who could run through air and water faster than any horse. This boar would become the prized possession of Freyr. Next, Eitri placed gold in the forge and gave the same instructions. Again, Loki's fly bit Brokkr, this time on the neck, drawing blood. But Brokkr did not stop, and from the flames emerged Draupnir, a golden arm ring that, every ninth night, would drip 8 new rings of equal weight and beauty. This ring would become one of Odin's treasures. Finally, Eitri placed iron in the forge and told his brother this was the most crucial moment. He must not stop pumping for even an instant. Loki, seeing this was his last chance, transformed and bit Brokkr on the eyelid, causing blood to flow into his eye. For just a moment, Brokkr raised his hand to wipe away the blood, and in that brief pause, the work was effected. When Eitri opened the forge, he pulled out Mjolnir, a hammer with a short handle. The handle was shorter than it should have been because of that momentary pause in the bellows work. Despite this flaw, Eitri pronounced it the most powerful weapon ever created. The hammer would never miss its target, no matter how far or hard it was thrown. It would always return to the hand of its thrower, and it could shrink down small enough to be hidden inside a shirt, then grow to full size when needed. The dwarves brought their 3 creations to Asgard to be judged against the gifts of the sons of Ivaldi. The gods assembled, and it was agreed that Odin, Thor, and Freyr would decide which items were most magnificent. The hair, ship, and spear were presented first and praised. Then came the boar, the ring, and the hammer. When Thor lifted Mjolnir and felt its power, when the gods understood its capabilities, the decision was clear. Mjolnir was judged the most valuable treasure because it alone could defend Asgard against the giants. Brokkr demanded his prize, Loki's head. But Loki, ever the trickster, argued that while Brokkr could have his head, he had not wagered his neck, and the brothers could not have the neck. The gods, perhaps amused by this logic, agreed. So Brokkr instead sewed Loki's lips shut with a leather strap, silencing the trickster for a time, though Loki soon tore the stitches free. From that day forward, Thor wielded Mjolnir, and it became his defining attribute. The hammer was both a weapon of destruction and a tool of consecration. Thor used it to slay giants who threatened the gods or humans, but he also used it to bless marriages, to hallow graves, and to consecrate important oaths. When Vikings wore hammer amulets around their necks, they were calling upon Thor's protection and power. To wield Mjolnir properly, Thor required special equipment. He wore Njord, a magical belt that doubled his already immense strength when he buckled it on, and he wore Jarngreipr, iron gloves that allowed him to grasp the hammer's short handle and control its power. Fully equipped with these items, Thor was the mightiest warrior in all the 9 worlds. Thor's primary role was as protector. While Odin might start wars and manipulate heroes, Thor actively defended the ordered cosmos against the forces of chaos, primarily embodied by the Jotnar, the giants. It is important to understand that the Norse giants were not necessarily larger than the gods, though some were enormous. Rather, they represented untamed nature, avalanches, earthquakes, destructive storms, wildfires. They were chaos to the gods' order, entropy to their structure. Utgard Loki challenged the travelers to contests. Loki competed in an eating contest, but was defeated by Logi, who consumed not just the meat, but the bones and even the wooden plates. Thialfi raced against Hugi, but could not match his speed. Thor attempted 3 feats. First, he tried to drain a drinking horn, but could barely lower the level after 3 mighty drinks. Second, he tried to lift the king's cat, but could raise only one of its paws from the floor. Third, he wrestled with an old woman named Ellie and was brought to one knee. Humiliated, Thor and his companions prepared to leave the next morning. But at the gates, Loki revealed the truth. Everything had been an illusion. Logi was wildfire itself, which consumes everything. Hugi was thought, which moves faster than any physical thing. The drinking horn was connected to the ocean, and Thor had drunk so much he had created the tides. The cat was actually Jormungandr, the world serpent that encircled Midgard, and Thor had nearly pulled it from the ocean floor, which would have ended the world. And Ellie was old age itself, which defeats even the gods eventually. Thor had performed near impossible feats, and Loki admitted he would never let Thor come near his hall again, for the god's power was too dangerous. Enraged at being tricked, Thor raised Mjolnir to destroy the giant king, but Loki and his entire hall vanished, leaving Thor standing in an empty field. This story illustrates something important about Thor. Despite his immense power, he could be deceived because he was honest and straightforward, without his father's cunning. Another famous tale involves Thor's fishing trip with the giant Hymir. Thor, disguised as a young man, went to the sea with Hymir to fish. The giant caught 2 whales, but Thor baited his hook with the head of Hymir's largest ox and cast his line into the deepest water. What he hooked was Jormungandr, the world serpent, his destined enemy. Thor pulled the serpent up toward the boat, and they stared at each other, god and monster, thunder and venom. Thor raised his hammer to strike the killing blow, but at that moment, terrified Hymir cut the fishing line, and the serpent sank back into the depths. Thor and Jormungandr were fated to meet 3 times. That fishing trip was the second meeting. Their first had been when Thor was disguised as a cat in Loki's hall. Their third and final meeting would come at Ragnarök, when Thor would at last slay the serpent, but die from its venom moments after his victory. But not all of Thor's adventures involved fighting. One tale tells of how his hammer was stolen by a giant named Thrym, who buried it 8 leagues deep in the earth and demanded Freyja as his bride in exchange for its return. The gods were horrified. Without Mjolnir, they were vulnerable to the giants, but Freyja absolutely refused to marry any giant. Heimdall suggested a plan. Thor himself would disguise himself as Freyja and go to Jotunheim to retrieve the hammer. Though mortified, Thor agreed. He was dressed in bridal clothes, veiled and adorned with Freyja's famous necklace, the Brisingamen. Loki accompanied him, disguised as a bridesmaid. When they arrived at Thrym's hall, the giant was delighted with his bride, though he was astonished at her appetite when she ate an entire ox and 8 salmon at the wedding feast. Loki explained that Freyja had been so excited to come to Jotunheim that she had not eaten for 8 days. When Thrym tried to kiss his bride and was startled by the fierce eyes glaring from beneath the veil, Loki explained that Freyja had not slept for 8 nights in her eagerness. At last, Thrym ordered Mjolnir to be brought forth and placed in the bride's lap to consecrate the marriage, as was custom. The moment Thor felt the hammer's handle in his grip, he threw off his disguise. His laughter was thunder itself as he stood revealed. With Mjolnir in hand once more, Thor slaughtered Thrym and all the giants in the hall and returned to Asgard with his hammer reclaimed. The story was doubtless told with great humor around Viking hearths, the mighty Thor humiliated but ultimately triumphant. Thor also had a chariot pulled by 2 goats named Tangrisnir and Tangjost, whose names meant teeth-bearer and teeth-grinder. These were no ordinary goats. Thor could slaughter them, cook and eat them in the evening, and then in the morning he would lay Mjolnir over their bones and hides, consecrate them, and they would come back to life, fully restored and ready to pull his chariot again. On one journey, Thor stayed with a farmer's family and shared his goats with them for dinner. But the farmer's son Thialfi, eager for the marrow, cracked one of the bones. When Thor resurrected the goats the next morning, one was lame. In his fury, Thor's eyes blazed and lightning crackled around him, terrifying the family. To make amends, the farmer offered his son Thialfi and daughter Roskva as servants to Thor, and they became his constant companions. Unlike Odin, Thor was widely worshipped by common people throughout the Viking world. Farmers called upon him for protection of their crops against destructive storms. Sailors invoked him for safe voyages. His hammer symbol became a protective amulet worn around the neck, much as crosses would be worn by Christians later. Thursday is named for him, Thor's Day. Thor represented qualities the Norse people valued: strength, courage, straightforwardness, reliability. He kept his word. He protected those weaker than himself. He faced his enemies directly rather than through schemes. While Odin was the god of kings and poets, Thor was the god of farmers and sailors, craftsmen and warriors. He was, in many ways, more human than his father, more comprehensible in his motivations and desires. Yet for all his power, Thor knew his fate. He knew that at Ragnarök, he would face Jormungandr in their final battle. He knew he would kill the serpent, fulfilling his role as protector one last time. And he knew that he would then walk 9 steps before falling dead from the monster's poison, leaving behind a world that would have to survive without him. But until that day came, he would continue his vigil, hammer ready, standing guard over gods and humans alike, the thunder that answers when chaos threatens. Thor remains, even today, one of the most recognizable figures from Norse mythology. His image carried forward into modern culture through countless adaptations. But in the original sources, in the poems and sagas written down in medieval Iceland, he was something more than just a powerful warrior. He was the embodiment of protection, the promise that no matter how dark the night or terrible the enemy, there was a defender standing watch, ready to answer the call with thunder and lightning and the crushing blow of Mjolnir. The Æsir, gods of war, order, and cosmic governance. The Æsir were not merely a collection of individual deities, but a divine tribe, a family of gods who dwelt in Asgard and represented the forces of order, sovereignty, warfare, and cosmic law. While Odin and Thor were the most prominent, they were far from alone. Around them gathered other powerful beings, each with their own roles, their own stories, their own contributions to the functioning of the cosmos. Chief among these was Frigg, wife of Odin and queen of the Æsir. Frigg was goddess of marriage, motherhood, and domestic affairs, but she was no passive consort. She possessed the gift of prophecy, knowing the fates of all beings, though she rarely spoke of what she knew. She dwelt in her own hall, Fensalir, and was attended by several goddesses who served as her handmaidens. Frigg's most notable characteristic was her love for her son Balder, the beautiful god whose death would mark the beginning of Ragnarök's inevitability. The story of Balder is one of the most poignant in Norse mythology. Balder was beloved by all beings, gods and mortals alike, for he was beautiful, wise, gentle, and fair in judgment. But Balder began to have troubling dreams, visions of his own death. When he told his mother of these nightmares, Frigg became determined to protect him. She traveled throughout the 9 worlds, extracting oaths from every creature, every plant, every stone, every disease, every element, making them all swear never to harm Balder. When she returned to Asgard, the gods discovered that Balder had become essentially invulnerable. To celebrate this, they made a game of throwing weapons at him and watching them bounce off harmlessly. Everyone enjoyed this except Loki, who grew jealous of Balder's invincibility and popularity. The trickster disguised himself as an old woman and visited Frigg, drawing from her the one piece of information that would prove fatal. She had not extracted an oath from the mistletoe, which had seemed too young and insignificant to bother with. Loki found a sprig of mistletoe and fashioned it into a dart. He then approached Balder's blind brother, Hod, who was standing apart from the games because he could not see to throw anything at Balder. Loki offered to guide his hand, placing the mistletoe dart in it and directing his aim. When Hod threw the dart, it pierced Balder's heart, and the beautiful god fell dead. The grief that followed shook all the worlds. Frigg sent a messenger named Hermod to Helheim to plead with Hel, the goddess of the dead, to release Balder. Hel agreed on one condition: if every single being in all the worlds would weep for Balder, she would release him. The gods sent messengers everywhere, and all creatures wept. Gods, humans, animals, plants, even the stones shed tears. But in a cave, the messengers found a giantess named Thok, who refused to weep, saying she had received nothing from Balder in life and would give nothing for him in death. This giantess was likely Loki in disguise, ensuring that the one being he needed to refuse would do so. Because not all beings wept, Balder remained in Helheim, and the beginning of the end had arrived. For his crime, Loki was hunted down by the gods. He transformed himself into a salmon and hid in a waterfall, but Thor caught him. The gods dragged Loki into a cave where they bound him with the entrails of his own son, Nafi, which the gods transformed into iron chains. Above his head, they placed a serpent whose venom dripped onto his face. Loki's faithful wife Sigyn stayed with him, holding a bowl to catch the venom, but when she had to turn away to empty the bowl, the venom would drip onto Loki's face, and his writhing caused earthquakes throughout the world. There he would remain until Ragnarök came and his bonds would break. Another prominent member of the Æsir was Tyr, the god of war and justice. But Tyr's understanding of war was different from Odin's. Where Odin represented the chaotic fury of battle and the gathering of the slain, Tyr represented the lawful aspects of warfare: oaths, treaties, rules of engagement, and honorable combat. He was also associated with law and justice more broadly, with legal assemblies and binding contracts. Tyr's most famous deed involved the binding of Fenrir, the monstrous wolf who was one of Loki's children. The gods had raised Fenrir in Asgard, but as he grew larger and more dangerous, they became afraid. Prophecy told that Fenrir would slay Odin at Ragnarök, and the gods decided he must be bound. They challenged Fenrir to test his strength against various chains, framing it as a game to prove how mighty he was. Twice they brought chains, and twice Fenrir broke them easily. Then the gods commissioned the dwarves to create Gleipnir, a magical ribbon woven from 6 impossible things: the sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, and the spittle of a bird. Because these things do not exist, Gleipnir was impossibly strong, despite appearing as thin as a silk ribbon. When the gods brought Gleipnir to Fenrir, the wolf was suspicious. This ribbon looked too weak to be a true test of strength, yet the gods seemed too eager for him to try it. Fenrir agreed to be bound by Gleipnir only if one of the gods would place his hand in Fenrir's mouth as a pledge of good faith. If the gods were playing fair, the god's hand would be safe. If they were treacherous, at least Fenrir would take a hand as compensation. The gods looked at each other, and none wanted to sacrifice his hand. But Tyr, god of oaths and honor, understood that this was necessary. He stepped forward and placed his right hand, his sword hand, in Fenrir's mouth. The gods bound the wolf with Gleipnir, and when Fenrir tried to break free and found he could not, he bit down, severing Tyr's hand at the wrist. From that day forward, Tyr was one-handed, having sacrificed his sword hand for the good of all. The gods took Fenrir far from Asgard and chained him to a massive boulder deep in the earth where he would remain until Ragnarök. Tyr's sacrifice established him as a god of courage and honor, willing to suffer personal loss for the greater good. Warriors invoked his name before battle, and people swore oaths by him, for he understood the binding power of one's word. Heimdall was another crucial member of the Æsir, though his origins were mysterious. He was called the White God, and the son of 9 mothers, possibly 9 giantesses who were sisters, though the details are unclear in surviving sources. Heimdall's role was guardian of Bifrost, the rainbow bridge that connected Asgard to the other worlds. He dwelt in a hall called Himinbjörg at the edge of heaven, and his watchfulness was legendary. Heimdall required less sleep than a bird. His sight was so keen that he could see 100 leagues in any direction, by day or by night. His hearing was so sharp that he could hear grass growing on the earth and wool growing on sheep. He possessed a horn called Gjallarhorn, the ringing horn, which he would blow to warn of danger. When Ragnarök came and the giants marched on Asgard, it would be Heimdall who sounded the alarm that would summon all the gods to their final battle. Heimdall was said to be Loki's greatest enemy among the gods, and the two were fated to slay each other at Ragnarök. Some sources suggest that Heimdall had disguised himself as a man named Rig and traveled through Midgard, fathering the 3 classes of human society: the thralls or slaves, the carls or free farmers, and the jarls or nobles. In this way, he established social order among humankind. Bragi was the god of poetry and eloquence, said to have runes carved on his tongue. He welcomed fallen heroes to Valhalla and entertained them with verses about their deeds and the deeds of ancient heroes. His wife was Idun, goddess of youth, who kept the golden apples of immortality. These apples were what kept the gods young and strong. Without them, the gods would age and weaken like mortals. On one occasion, Loki's schemes resulted in Idun being kidnapped by a giant, and the gods rapidly began to grow old and grey until she was rescued. Forseti was the god of justice and reconciliation, son of Balder and his wife Nanna. He dwelt in a hall called Glitnir, which had silver pillars and a gold roof. When gods or men had disputes they could not resolve, they would come to Forseti, and by the time they left his presence, all quarrels had been settled peacefully. He represented law and mediation rather than the warrior justice of Tyr. Uller was a god associated with skiing, hunting, and archery. Little survives about his myths, but his name appears in many place names throughout Scandinavia, suggesting he was widely worshipped. He was called upon for duels and for success in hunting during the winter months. Vidar, son of Odin and the giantess Grid, was known as the Silent God because he spoke rarely. But he was one of the strongest of all the Æsir, second only to Thor. At Ragnarök, after Fenrir killed Odin, it would be Vidar who avenged his father. He would place his foot on the wolf's lower jaw and grasp the upper jaw with his hand, tearing Fenrir's mouth apart and killing the beast. Vidar would be one of the few gods to survive Ragnarök and live in the world that came after. Vali, another of Odin's sons, was conceived specifically to avenge Balder's death. Born of Odin and the giantess Rinda, Vali grew to adulthood in a single day. That same day, he slew Hod, Balder's blind brother, who had been tricked into killing Balder. Vali represented the Norse custom of blood vengeance, the duty of a kinsman to avenge a murdered relative. He too would survive Ragnarök. Hoenir was a somewhat mysterious god who often accompanied Odin and Loki on their journeys. He was tall and handsome, but not particularly wise or decisive, often relying on Mimir for counsel. When the Æsir sent hostages to the Vanir after their war, Hoenir was one of those sent. The Vanir initially thought him wise because Mimir, who was also sent, would whisper advice to him. When the Vanir eventually realized Hoenir could not think for himself, they were so offended they beheaded Mimir and sent his head back to Odin. These gods and goddesses formed the community of Asgard. They were not omnipotent or omniscient. They had limitations, made mistakes, experienced emotions, and faced mortality. Unlike many other mythological pantheons, the Norse gods knew they would one day die. This knowledge infused their myths with a particular quality, a sense of defiance in the face of fate, courage despite knowing the outcome, and a determination to fight well even in a losing battle. The Æsir represented civilization, culture, law, and order. They built mighty halls, forged great treasures, established rules and customs. They were the gods of human society, reflecting the values that Viking culture held dear: courage, loyalty, honor, hospitality, and willingness to face death without flinching. Yet the Æsir were not the only gods in the Norse cosmos. Another divine tribe existed, one with different values, different magical practices, different understandings of power. These were the Vanir, and the conflict and eventual alliance between these two groups of gods would shape the structure of the divine world. If the Æsir represented civilization, war, and sovereignty, the Vanir embodied nature, fertility, and magic. They were associated with the prosperity of fields, the bounty of harvest, the turning of seasons, and the mysterious forces of Sidra, a practice of magic involving prophecy, transformation, and manipulation of fate. The Vanir were fewer in number than the Æsir, at least in the sources that survive, but they were no less powerful, and in some ways their magic was more ancient and more fundamental than the powers commanded by Odin and his kin. The Vanir dwelt in Vanaheim, one of the 9 worlds suspended in the branches of Yggdrasil. Unlike Asgard, with its golden halls and mighty fortifications, Vanaheim was depicted as a green and fertile land, abundant with life, closely connected to the rhythms of nature. The Vanir understood the deep magic of growth and decay, of life springing from death, of the cycles that governed all living things. The 3 most prominent Vanir in Norse mythology were Njord and his 2 children, Freyr and Freyja. These 3 would, after the war between the Æsir and Vanir, come to live in Asgard as hostages and honored allies, bringing their knowledge and power to the halls of the Æsir and enriching the divine community with their magic. Njord was the god of the sea, but not the tempestuous ocean that drowned ships. Rather, he governed the calm seas that brought prosperity through fishing and trade, the harbors where ships found safety, the shores where fishermen cast their nets. He was associated with wealth that came from the sea, with favorable winds for sailing, with maritime commerce that brought exotic goods from distant lands. Vikings and coastal peoples called upon Njord for safe voyages and good catches. Njord's marriage was one of the stranger tales in Norse mythology. After the war between the Æsir and Vanir ended, the giantess Skadi came to Asgard seeking compensation for the death of her father, the giant Thjazi, whom the gods had slain. To appease her, the gods offered to let her choose a husband from among them, but she could choose only by looking at their feet, with the rest of their bodies hidden. She chose the cleanest, most beautiful feet, thinking they must belong to Balder, the most handsome of the gods. But they belonged to Njord, whose feet were clean and pale from his association with the purifying salt water of the sea. The marriage was troubled from the start. Skadi loved the mountains where she had grown up, the high frozen peaks where she could ski and hunt. Njord loved the seashore with its gentle waves and crying gulls. They tried to compromise, spending 9 nights in Skadi's mountain hall of Thrymheim, then 9 nights in Njord's hall of Noatun by the sea. But neither could bear the other's home. Skadi could not sleep for the sound of the waves and the cries of seabirds. Njord could not rest for the howling of wolves in the mountains. Eventually they parted, each returning to the home they loved. But Njord's children would become more central to the Norse mythological tradition than their father. Freyr and Freyja, brother and sister, were deities of immense power and importance, worshipped widely throughout the Viking world. Freyr was the god of fertility, prosperity, and peace. His very name meant Lord, and he was called upon to bless crops, ensure good harvests, bring peace between neighbors, and grant prosperity to households. He was associated with sunshine and rain in their gentle, life-giving forms, with the virility of animals and the fertility of soil. He was said to be the ancestor of the Swedish royal line, and rulers traced their legitimacy through descent from him. Freyja possessed several remarkable treasures. One was Skidbladnir, the ship created by the sons of Ivaldi that could sail over land and sea and sky, always had favorable winds, and could be folded up small enough to fit in one's pocket when not needed. Another was Gullinbursti, the golden boar with bristles that glowed in the dark, who could run faster than any horse through air and over water. This boar pulled Freyja's chariot and was sacred to him. But Freyja's most famous story involved his sacrifice of his greatest weapon for love. One day, Freyja sat upon Hlidskjalf, Odin's high seat from which one could see into all the worlds. Looking out across the cosmos, his gaze fell upon a beautiful woman in Jotunheim. This was Gerd, daughter of the giant Geimir. She was so beautiful that when she raised her arms, all the worlds were illuminated by the light reflecting from them. Freyja was struck with such love and longing that he fell into melancholy and would not eat or speak. Concerned, his father Njord sent Freyja's servant Skirnir to discover what troubled him. When Skirnir learned of his master's love for a giantess, he agreed to journey to Jotunheim to woo Gerd on Freyja's behalf, but only if Freyja would give him his sword. This sword was magical, capable of fighting by itself without a hand to wield it. Despite knowing he would need this weapon at Ragnarök, Freyja was so consumed by love that he gave the sword to Skirnir. Skirnir traveled to Jotunheim and attempted to persuade Gerd to accept Freyja's suit, offering her golden apples and the ring Draupnir. When she refused all bribes, he threatened her with a staff marked with runes, cursing her with loneliness, monstrous ugliness, and eternal frustration if she did not accept. Finally, Gerd agreed to meet Freyr in 9 days at a place called Barri, a sacred grove. Freyr gained his bride but lost his sword, and at Ragnarök he would face the fire giant Surtur weaponless. Some sources say he fought with a stag's antler, others say simply that he fell quickly. His sacrifice of his weapon for love demonstrated the Vanir understanding that fertility and life were worth more than weapons of war. But it also showed the tragic cost of such choices in a cosmos heading toward inevitable destruction. Freyja, Freyja's sister, was perhaps the most complex and powerful of all the Vanir. She was goddess of love, beauty, and sexuality, but also a goddess of war, death, and magic. This combination of domains that might seem contradictory reflects the Vanir understanding that all these forces were interconnected, that love and death, beauty and battle were woven together in the fabric of existence. Freyja was breathtakingly beautiful, Desired by gods, giants, and men, she wore a cloak of falcon feathers that allowed her to fly through the 9 worlds. She rode in a chariot pulled by 2 cats, or sometimes she rode upon the boar Hildisvini. Her most prized possession was the Brisingamen, a magnificent necklace of gold and amber. The story of how Freyja acquired the Brisingamen reveals aspects of her character that later Christian writers found scandalous, but which reflect a more complex ancient understanding. Freyja one day came upon the workshop of 4 dwarven brothers, the Brisings, who were crafting a necklace of such beauty that it outshone the sun itself. Freyja desired the necklace desperately and asked the dwarves to name their price. The 4 brothers said that the necklace could be hers if she would spend 1 night with each of them. Freyja agreed, and after 4 nights the Brisingamen was hers. When Loki discovered this and told Odin, the Allfather commanded Loki to steal the necklace from Freyja as punishment for her behavior. But Heimdall stopped Loki, and the 2 fought. Eventually, Odin returned the necklace to Freyja on condition that she stir up an eternal battle between 2 kings, which she did. The story is complex and fragmentary in the sources, but it establishes that Freyja was powerful enough and independent enough to make her own choices, regardless of what the Æsir might think of them. Freyja was closely associated with Seder, the practice of Norse magic particularly connected to the Vanir. Seder involved entering trance states, prophecy, manipulating the threads of fate, shape-shifting, sending one's spirit forth from the body, and cursing enemies. It was considered powerful but somewhat shameful, particularly for men to practice, as it involved a kind of passive receptivity that contradicted the warrior ideal of direct action. But Freyja was a mistress of Seder, and she taught its secrets to Odin, who overcame his pride to learn from her. Freyja's association with death was as strong as her connection to love. She claimed half of all warriors who died in battle, taking them to her hall Folkvanga, Field of the Host, while Odin claimed the other half for Valhalla. This reflects the Vanir understanding that death and life, like winter and summer, were part of the same cycle. The sources do not explain how the division was made or whether Freyja had first choice, but her hall was said to be beautiful and vast, and those who went there were honored. Freyja was married to a god named Od, about whom almost nothing else is known. Od wandered away and did not return, and Freyja wept tears of red gold searching for him throughout the worlds, traveling under many assumed names. Her tears, falling to earth, became golden amber, precious and beautiful. This tale of Freyja's searching established her as a goddess, not just of joyful love, but of the sorrow and longing that accompany it. Because of her beauty and her association with both love and fertility, Freyja was desired by giants who sought to marry her or take her by force. Many Norse myths involve giants demanding Freyja as payment for some service or as ransom for some stolen property. The gods always refused, finding other ways to resolve the situation, for Freyja represented something too valuable and too sacred to be given away, even to save themselves. The Vanir brought to the Norse pantheon an understanding of natural cycles, of magic that came from within, rather than being imposed from without, of the interconnectedness of seemingly opposite forces. Where the Æsir built halls and forged weapons, the Vanir grew crops and worked magic. Where the Æsir valued courage in the face of death, the Vanir valued life and the continuation of life through fertility and harvest. Both perspectives were necessary. The Æsir alone would have created a cosmos of endless warfare and strict hierarchies. The Vanir alone would have lacked the structure and defensive strength to survive against the forces of chaos. Together, these 2 divine tribes would form a complete pantheon, one that reflected the full spectrum of human experience and natural phenomena. But before that union could occur, war had to come first. The war between the Æsir and the Vanir stands as one of the most significant events in Norse mythology. Yet the surviving sources provide only fragments of the story, tantalizing glimpses into a conflict whose full details have been lost to time. What remains suggests a war unlike the battles against giants or monsters, a war between 2 groups who each represented divine power, but understood that power in fundamentally different ways. The cause of the war, as recorded in the Prose Edda written by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century, began with the arrival of a mysterious woman in Asgard. She called herself Gullveig, which meant gold drunk or gold might, suggesting an association with wealth and possibly greed. The identity of Gullveig has been debated by scholars. Some believe she was actually Freyja traveling under one of her many names, as the Vanir goddess was known to use various identities, though the sources do not make this connection explicit. Gullveig practiced cider magic in the halls of Asgard, performing her spells and divinations before the Æsir. The Æsir, uncomfortable with this form of magic that they associated with the Vanir and with women, viewed her presence with suspicion and hostility. Their discomfort grew until they could no longer tolerate her. In a shocking act of violence, they seized Gullveig and thrust her into the fire, burning her alive. But Gullveig did not die. 3 times the Æsir burned her in the fire, and 3 times she emerged reborn, as radiant and powerful as before. This act of attempting to destroy her and her repeated resurrections demonstrated the fundamental difference between the 2 divine tribes. The Vanir understood the cycles of death and rebirth, the way life emerges from death like spring from winter. The Æsir, focused on warfare and hierarchy, sought to destroy what they could not control. When word of this outrage reached the Vanir in Vanaheim, they were enraged. Whether Gullveig had been their representative or simply someone under their protection, the Æsir's actions could not be ignored. The Vanir demanded compensation, likely in the form of vergild, the payment owed for killing someone. When the Æsir refused or the negotiations broke down, war became inevitable. The Vanir marched on Asgard, and the first war among gods began. The accounts of the actual fighting are sparse. We know that the Vanir's magic proved formidable against the Æsir's martial might. The walls of Asgard were broken down, whether by Vanir spells or by simple force of arms, the sources do not clearly say. The Vanir advanced into Asgard itself, bringing the battle to the very halls of Odin and his kin. But neither side could achieve final victory. The Æsir were mighty in battle, with warriors like Thor and Tyr, with Odin's cunning and the courage of their fighters. Yet the Vanir commanded magic that could counter strength, that could twist fate and call upon natural forces the Æsir could not fully control. The war dragged on, devastating both sides, until both Æsir and Vanir realized that continued fighting would only weaken them all, leaving them vulnerable to the giants and other enemies. Recognizing the futility of further conflict, the 2 tribes agreed to make peace. They met and negotiated terms, and the treaty they forged would change the structure of the Norse divine world forever. Rather than simply agreeing to stop fighting, the Æsir and Vanir decided to truly unite, to become one pantheon rather than 2 separate tribes. To seal this alliance and ensure neither side would betray the other, they exchanged hostages, a common practice in Viking Age diplomacy. The Vanir sent to Asgard their most prominent members, Njord and his 2 children, Freyja and Freyr. These 3 would live among the Æsir, honored and respected, bringing their knowledge of fertility magic and satyr to enrich the Æsir's understanding. The Æsir sent to Vanaheim Honir, the tall and handsome god who often accompanied Odin, and Mimir, the wise being whose knowledge was unmatched. The choice of Honir seemed a good one initially. He was impressive in appearance and seemed thoughtful in his words. But the Vanir soon discovered that Honir was not truly wise on his own. Whenever he needed to make a decision, he would say, "Let others decide," or give vague non-answers. They realized that Honir had always relied on Mimir to whisper advice to him, and without Mimir's counsel, Honir was indecisive and useless. Feeling deceived, believing the Æsir had sent them a fool while keeping the wise Mimir's counsel for themselves through proximity, the Vanir were enraged. In retaliation, they beheaded Mimir and sent his head back to Odin. But as we have discussed, Odin preserved Mimir's head with herbs and magic, and it continued to serve as his advisor, speaking wisdom whenever consulted. Despite this act of violence, the peace held. Perhaps both sides had seen enough of war. To further cement their alliance, all the gods, both Æsir and Vanir, participated in a ritual. They each spat into a great vessel, and from their combined spittle, they created a being named Kvasir. This creation was symbolic, a mixing of the divine essences of both tribes into one being. But Kvasir was more than symbolic. He became the wisest being ever to exist, able to answer any question put to him. He wandered the worlds, sharing his knowledge freely with all who asked. Tragically, Kvasir's wisdom became his downfall. Two dwarves, Fjalar and Gala, invited Kvasir to their home and then murdered him, draining his blood into 3 vessels, 2 jars called Son and Bodden, and a pot called Odrerir. They mixed his blood with honey, creating the mead of poetry. Anyone who drank this mead would become a skilled poet or scholar, able to compose verses and speak with eloquence. The dwarves killed others after Kvasir, including a giant named Gilling and his wife, which brought Gilling's son Suttung seeking vengeance. Suttung took the dwarves out to a rock that would be submerged at high tide and left them there to drown. In their terror, the dwarves offered him the mead of poetry as payment for their lives. Suttung accepted and took the mead back to his home in the mountains, where he hid it deep inside the mountain Hnitbjorg, with his daughter Gunnlod set to guard it. But Odin, ever hungry for wisdom and poetry, learned of the mead's existence and was determined to obtain it. He disguised himself as a man named Bolverk and hired himself out to Baugi, Suttung's brother, to work for a summer. Odin did the work of 9 men, and when summer ended, he asked for a drink of Suttung's mead as payment. Baugi said he had no control over the mead, but agreed to help Odin try to get it. They went to the mountain, and Odin produced an auger called Rati. Baugi drilled into the mountain while Odin watched. When Baugi said he had broken through, Odin blew into the hole, and chips of stone flew back into his face, revealing that Baugi had not fully penetrated the mountain and was trying to trick him. Odin insisted Baugi drill further, and when the hole was truly complete, Odin transformed himself into a snake and slithered through the hole into the mountain. Inside, he found Gunnlod guarding the mead. Odin remained with her for 3 nights, and she allowed him 3 drinks of the mead. With the first drink, he drained the pot Odrerir completely. With the second, he emptied the jar Bodden. With the third, he drained Son. Having consumed all the mead, Odin transformed himself into an eagle and flew away as fast as he could. Suttung, discovering the theft, transformed into an eagle as well, and pursued Odin across the sky. The Æsir, seeing Odin approaching with Suttung close behind, set out vessels in the courtyard of Asgard. Odin, reaching Asgard just ahead of his pursuer, spat the mead into the vessels. But he was in such haste that some of the mead came out the other end, falling wherever it might. The mead that Odin properly spat into the vessels became the gift he gave to gods and to those humans he favored, making them true poets and scholars. The mead that fell randomly became the portion of bad poets, those who have some skill with words but lack true talent. This tale of Kvasir and the mead of poetry demonstrated how the union of Æsir and Vanir had created something greater than either tribe possessed alone. From their combined essence came the wisest being, and from his blood came the source of poetic inspiration that would preserve their stories for generations to come. The integration of the Vanir into Asgard enriched the Æsir's understanding of the cosmos. Freyja taught Odin the secrets of Cider, giving him access to a form of magic different from the rune magic he had learned through his self-sacrifice. Freyja's association with peace and prosperity balanced the Æsir's focus on warfare. Njord's connection to the wealth that comes from trade and fishing complemented the Æsir's emphasis on the wealth gained through battle. The war and subsequent alliance between the Æsir and Vanir can be interpreted in multiple ways. Some scholars see it as reflecting a mythologized memory of actual historical conflict between peoples who worshipped different gods, eventually merging their religions as their societies merged. Others view it as representing the tension between different aspects of society, the warrior aristocracy, symbolized by the Æsir, versus the farming class represented by the Vanir, or male-dominated martial culture contrasted with traditions that honored women's power through Seder magic. Another interpretation suggests it represents the conflict between settled agricultural communities and older hunter-gatherer or herding traditions. These remain scholarly theories rather than certainties, but they demonstrate how the myth may have encoded real social tensions within Norse culture. Whatever its origins, the Æsir-Vanir War established that the Norse pantheon was not static or monolithic. It contained within itself different perspectives, different values, different types of power. The gods were not all the same, did not all think alike, and had once been divided enough to make war upon each other. Yet they had found a way to make peace to recognize that they were stronger together than apart, to honor what each tribe brought to the cosmic order. This unity would be tested again and again by external threats, by giants who sought to tear down what the gods had built, by monsters born of chaos, by the inexorable approach of Ragnarök. But the alliance forged in the aftermath of the Æsir Vanir war would hold. The combined divine family, enriched by the presence of both Æsir and Vanir, would stand together against the darkness, knowing that when the final battle came, they would face it as one. Ragnarök, the doom of gods and the rebirth of the world. From the moment of creation, from the first time Odin drank from the well of wisdom and saw into the depths of fate, the Norse gods knew how their story would end. Unlike the immortal gods of many mythologies who rule forever unchanging, the Æsir and Vanir understood that their time was limited. The end was not a possibility to be avoided, but a certainty to be faced with courage. This end was called Ragnarök, which means the fate of the gods, or the twilight of the gods, though the latter translation comes from a later German interpretation. Ragnarök was not simply the death of gods, but the destruction and subsequent rebirth of the entire cosmos. It was the ultimate expression of the Norse understanding that all things are cyclical, that even gods and worlds must die so that new life can emerge from the ashes. The prophecy of Ragnarök hung over every action the gods took, giving their triumphs a bittersweet quality, for they knew that nothing they built would last forever. The approach of Ragnarök would be heralded by many signs, each one marking the world's slide toward chaos and destruction. The first great sign would be the Fimbul winter, a winter unlike any that had come before. For 3 consecutive years, snow would fall without cease. No summer would come between them, no thaw, no respite. Bitter winds would howl from all directions. The sun would provide no warmth, and the world would freeze in darkness and cold. During this endless winter, the bonds of society would break down. Brother would fight brother, and fathers would turn against their sons. All kinship would be forgotten in the desperate struggle for survival. The sacred bonds of hospitality would be violated. Oaths would be broken without shame. It would be, as the Völuspá describes, an axe age, a sword age, shields will be cloven, a wind age, a wolf age, before the world crumbles. But these were merely the early warnings. The true signs of Ragnarök's arrival would be cosmic. The first would be the breaking of chains. Fenrir, the monstrous wolf whom the gods had bound with Gleipnir, would finally break free from his bonds. The great wolf's struggles would cause earthquakes throughout the worlds, shaking the very roots of Yggdrasil. At sea, another of Loki's children would stir. Jormungandr, the world serpent that encircled Midgard with its tail in its mouth, would release its tail and surge up from the ocean depths. Its writhing would cause tidal waves that would swallow coastlines and flood the lowlands. The serpent would crawl onto land, its venom spraying into the air and raining down upon the earth, poisoning everything it touched. Loki himself would break free from his bonds in the cave where the gods had imprisoned him. His faithful wife Sigyn, who had caught the serpent's venom in her bowl for so long, would finally abandon her post. Loki would emerge, terrible in his wrath, ready to have his vengeance against the gods who had killed his son and bound him in torment. In the fiery realm of Muspelheim, Surtur the fire giant would arise with his flaming sword. The giant who had waited since before the world's creation would finally march forth, and behind him would come the sons of Muspel, an army of fire giants riding across Bifrost, the Rainbow Bridge. The bridge would shatter under their weight and heat, breaking the connection between Asgard and the other worlds. From the east would come another ship, Naglfar, built from the untrimmed fingernails and toenails of the dead. This grim vessel, commanded by the giant Hrym, would carry an army of giants toward the final battlefield. Loki would steer this ship, bringing his allies to make war on the gods who had cast him down. From the realm of ice would come the frost giants, led by Thrym or perhaps other giant lords, marching south to join the battle. From Helheim would come the dishonorable dead, all those who died of sickness or old age rather than in battle, led by Hel herself, Loki's daughter who ruled the land of the dead. In Asgard, Heimdall would see the enemies approaching from his post at the edge of heaven. The white god, who required less sleep than a bird and could see 100 leagues in any direction, would sound his horn Gjallarhorn, and its blast would echo through all the 9 worlds. The sound would wake Odin and all the gods, alerting them that the moment they had always known would come had finally arrived. Odin would ride to consult with Mimir's head one final time, seeking any last wisdom that might help in the battle to come. The gods would don their armor and take up their weapons. In Valhalla, the Einherjar, the slain warriors Odin had been gathering for precisely this moment, would arm themselves and march out beside the gods. From Folkvanger, Freyja's hall, would come her chosen slain as well. Every warrior the gods could muster would gather for the final battle. The forces would meet on a vast plain called Vigrid, which stretched 100 leagues in every direction. Here, gods and giants, monsters and heroes, forces of order and forces of chaos would clash in the ultimate battle. Odin would lead the charge, wearing his golden helmet and wielding Gungnir, his spear that never missed. He would ride Sleipnir directly toward Fenrir, the great wolf whose jaws could swallow the sky. But Odin would be weaponless in a sense, for his strength had never been martial might but wisdom and magic. Against Fenrir's primal fury, even the Allfather's knowledge would not be enough. The wolf would swallow Odin whole, and the father of gods would perish. But Odin's death would not go unavenged. Vidar, the silent god, Odin's son by the giantess Grid, would stride forward. He would place his foot, shod in a shoe that had been prepared for this very moment, upon the wolf's lower jaw. Some sources say this shoe was made from all the leather scraps that people had cut away when making shoes, collected throughout time for this purpose. With his hands, Vidar would grasp Fenrir's upper jaw and tear the great wolf's mouth apart, killing the beast that had slain the Allfather. Thor would face his ancient enemy Jormungandr in their third and final meeting. The thunder god and the world serpent had confronted each other when Thor was disguised in Utgard Loki's hall, and again when Thor fished for the serpent in the sea with the giant Hymir. Now they would meet for the last time, and one of them would not walk away. The battle between Thor and Jormungandr would shake the worlds. Thor would strike the serpent with Mjolnir, and the blow would crack the monster's skull, killing it at last. But as the serpent died, it would breathe out all its venom in one final exhalation, and the poisonous cloud would engulf Thor. The god would manage to walk 9 steps away from the serpent's corpse before he would fall dead from the poison, his hammer still clutched in his hand. Freyr, who had given away his magical sword for love of the giantess Gerd, would face Surtur, the ancient fire giant. Without his sword, Freyr would be nearly defenseless. Some sources say he fought with the antler of a stag, but against Surtur's flaming blade, it would not be enough. Freyr would fall, and the brightest of the Vanir would die far from his green fields and golden halls. Tyr, the one-handed god of war and justice, would face Garm, the great hound that guarded the gates of Helheim. The two would slay each other in single combat, the god of oaths and the beast of death dying together. Heimdall and Loki, enemies throughout the ages, would finally confront each other. The guardian of Bifrost and the trickster who had brought so much chaos to the gods would fight, and like Tyr and Garm, they would kill each other. With Heimdall's death, the gods would lose their watchmen, and with Loki's death perhaps some small measure of justice would be served, though it would come too late to matter. The battle would rage on, and one by one the gods and heroes would fall. The Einherjar would die their second deaths, this time permanently. The giants and monsters would be slaughtered as well, but their numbers would overwhelm the defenders of Asgard. In the end, only destruction would remain victorious. Surtur, having slain Freyr, would raise his flaming sword and set the world ablaze. Fire would consume Asgard, burning the golden halls to ash. It would spread to Midgard, engulfing the world of humans in flames. The 9 worlds would burn, and even Yggdrasil, the mighty world tree that had held reality together since the beginning, would be consumed by fire. Some sources suggest the tree would burn but survive, blackened and damaged, but still standing as a testament to endurance. The stars would fall from the sky. The sun and moon, which had been chased across the heavens by wolves since the beginning of time, would finally be caught and devoured. Darkness would cover everything. The earth would sink into the sea, and the waters would rise to cover all the land. Everything that had been would cease to be. But Ragnarök was not only an ending, it was also a beginning. The Norse understood that from death comes new life, that destruction allows for rebirth. When the fires died and the waters receded, the earth would emerge again from the sea, green and fertile, more beautiful than before. Grass would grow where ash had been, forests would spring up, and fields would flourish without needing to be planted. Some gods would survive. Vidar, who had avenged his father by slaying Fenrir, would live on. Vali, Odin's son who had avenged Balder, would endure. Modi and Magni, Thor's sons, would survive and claim Mjolnir from where it had fallen when their father died. Hoenir, the indecisive god who had been sent as a hostage to the Vanir, would somehow survive, perhaps because he had always been skilled at avoiding taking definitive positions. These surviving gods would gather in Idavol, the place where Asgard had once stood, and they would remember the old times, speaking of former glories and finding among the ruins the golden gaming pieces the Æsir had once played with. Most miraculously, Balder and Hod would return from Helheim, the beautiful god whose death had marked the beginning of the end, and the blind brother who had been tricked into killing him. Reconciled, they would live in the new world, representing a fresh start, free from the tragic cycles of the past. From somewhere, a woman and a man would emerge, having hidden themselves in a place called Hodmimir's Wood during the destruction. Their names would be Lif and Lifthrasir, meaning life and eager for life. They would have survived by drinking the morning dew, and from them would come a new human race to inhabit the reborn earth. They would look up and see a new sun in the sky, born from the old sun before it was devoured, shining down on a world innocent and unmarred. In this new world, the cycles would begin again. Perhaps new gods would arise, or perhaps the surviving gods would build a different kind of order, one that had learned from the mistakes of the past. The sources do not tell us clearly what this new world would be like, whether it would eventually follow the same path toward another Ragnarök, or whether the cycle had finally been broken. The prophecy of Ragnarök served multiple purposes in Norse thought. On one level, it was a reflection of the harsh realities of Viking Age life in Scandinavia, where communities lived close to the edge of survival, where a bad winter could mean starvation, where violence was common and life was uncertain. The knowledge that even gods could die, that even the mightiest powers in the cosmos were not eternal, resonated with people who understood mortality intimately. On another level, Ragnarök represented the Norse values of courage and honor. Knowing that they would die did not make the gods despair or abandon their responsibilities. Instead, they fought all the harder, gathering warriors, preparing for battle, standing guard against chaos every day, even though they knew that chaos would eventually triumph. What mattered was not victory, but how one faced defeat. The gods would die, but they would die fighting, weapons in hand, having done everything they could to protect the cosmos they had built. The cyclical nature of Ragnarök also reflected Norse observations of the natural world, where winter always follows autumn, where death precedes rebirth, where forest fires, though devastating, allow new growth to flourish. The cosmos itself breathed like a living thing, and Ragnarök was simply the greatest of many cycles, operating at different scales throughout reality. Christian writers who recorded these myths centuries after the Viking Age sometimes tried to interpret Ragnarök as a pagan precursor to Christian apocalyptic thought, or as evidence that the Norse had somehow anticipated Christian revelations about the end times. But Ragnarök is fundamentally different from Christian eschatology. There is no final judgment of souls, no eternal reward or punishment based on moral behavior, no ultimate triumph of good over evil in the cosmic sense. Instead, there is destruction followed by rebirth, and the understanding that this cycle might continue indefinitely. Some scholars suggest that the rebirth portion of the myth may have been added or emphasized after Christian influence reached Scandinavia, and that originally Ragnarök may have been truly final, a complete ending with no new beginning. The sources we have were all written down by Christians or in Christian times, making it difficult to know which elements are purely pagan and which show later influence. Regardless of these scholarly debates, Ragnarök remains one of the most powerful apocalyptic visions in world mythology. It gives the Norse myths their distinctive flavor, heroic but tragic, glorious but doomed, celebrating courage while acknowledging its ultimate futility against fate. The gods of Asgard knew they were mortal, knew their time was limited, knew they would fall. And yet, Each day they rose, took up their duties, and did what needed to be done. In this, perhaps, they were more truly noble than gods who reign forever without fear of ending. When we speak of Norse mythology today, we are not speaking of a living religion, but of stories preserved across centuries, translated through multiple languages, filtered through Christian perspectives, and reimagined by countless modern interpreters. The journey of these myths from the hearthfires of Viking Age Scandinavia to our modern screens and pages is itself a fascinating tale of survival, transformation, and rediscovery. During the Viking Age, roughly from the late 8th century to the mid-11th century, the worship of Odin, Thor, Freyr, and the other gods was central to Scandinavian life. Vikings built temples to their gods, though these structures were often simple compared to the elaborate religious buildings of contemporary Christian Europe. They made sacrifices, both of animals and, in rare cases, humans, particularly during times of dire crisis or at major festivals. They swore oaths by the gods, invoked their names in battle, and looked to them for protection, prosperity, and guidance. Different gods were emphasized by different social classes and in different contexts. As mentioned, farmers and common folk particularly revered Thor, the protector, who ensured their crops would not be destroyed by storms and who stood between them and the chaotic forces of nature. Kings and nobles often claimed special relationships with Odin, tracing their lineages back to the Allfather or seeking his favor for victory in battle. Freyja and Freyr were called upon for matters of love, fertility, and harvest. Tyr was invoked when oaths were sworn. The gods were understood as active participants in the world, beings who could be petitioned, bargained with, and hopefully influenced through proper sacrifice and behavior. But the Viking Age was also the period when Christianity began to spread through Scandinavia. Christian missionaries, backed by political pressure from Christian kingdoms to the south and east, gradually converted the Norse peoples. The process took centuries and was not always peaceful. Some kings converted for political advantages, seeing Christianity as a way to align with powerful European kingdoms. Others resisted fiercely, viewing Christianity as a foreign intrusion that threatened their traditional ways. The conversion process resulted in a fascinating period of religious syncretism, where elements of both religions coexisted. Some people wore both Thor's hammer amulets and Christian crosses. Some kings were baptized, but continued to make sacrifices to the old gods. Christian prayers were sometimes adapted to ask for intercession from Norse saints, who seemed to have attributes of the old gods. By around 1100 CE, Scandinavia was officially Christian, though pagan practices likely continued in remote areas for some time after. The old gods were no longer openly worshipped. Their temples fell into disrepair or were converted to churches. The elaborate mythological knowledge that had been passed down orally for generations began to fade as the society that had created and maintained these stories transformed into something new. And yet the myths did not disappear entirely. In Iceland, which was settled by Norse peoples during the Viking Age and converted to Christianity around the year 1000, scholars began to write down the old stories. The most important of these scholars was Snorri Sturluson, an Icelandic chieftain, poet, and historian who lived from 1179 to 1241. Snorri wrote the Prose Edda, a comprehensive guide to Norse mythology, written partly as a handbook for poets who wanted to understand the kennings and references in Old Norse poetry. Snorri's work preserved detailed narratives about the gods, their adventures, and their fates. He described the creation of the world, told stories of Thor's journeys to Jotunheim, explained how Loki came to be bound, and recounted the prophecy of Ragnarök. Though Snorri was a Christian writing centuries after the myths had ceased to be religious doctrine, he treated them with respect and worked to record them accurately based on older sources and oral traditions. The Poetic Edda, compiled from various sources and manuscripts, preserved actual poetry from the pagan period, including the Völuspá, a grand poem narrating the history of the cosmos from creation through Ragnarök, and the Havamal, a collection of wisdom sayings attributed to Odin. These poems, though written down by Christian scribes, likely preserve much older material, giving us glimpses into how the Vikings themselves thought about their gods. For centuries, these Icelandic manuscripts remained relatively obscure, known mainly to scholars of Old Norse. But in the 19th century, a wave of romantic nationalism swept across Europe, and intellectuals in Scandinavia and Germany began looking to their pre-Christian past for sources of national identity and cultural pride. The Norse myths were rediscovered, translated into modern languages, and celebrated as part of the Germanic cultural heritage. This rediscovery had both positive and negative consequences. On the positive side, it sparked genuine scholarly interest in Old Norse literature, led to better preservation of manuscripts, and brought these powerful myths to a wider audience. On the negative side, the myths were sometimes distorted to serve nationalist and later racialist agendas. In the 20th century, Nazi Germany attempted to appropriate Norse mythology as part of its ideology, twisting symbols like the runes and concepts like Valhalla to fit their horrific worldview. These misappropriations have complicated the modern reception of Norse mythology. Symbols like Thor's hammer or the Valknut have been used by white supremacist groups, forcing scholars and modern practitioners of Norse-inspired religions to work actively to reclaim these symbols and educate people about their proper historical context. It is important to understand that Norse mythology belongs to human cultural heritage broadly, that the Vikings themselves were diverse and interacted with many cultures, and that nothing in the actual myths supports racist ideology. In the 20th and 21st centuries, Norse mythology has experienced a remarkable revival in popular culture. The gods appear in countless novels, comic books, films, television shows, and video games. Marvel Comics transformed Thor into a superhero, bringing him to audiences who might never otherwise encounter Norse myths. Neil Gaiman wrote American Gods, which featured Odin as a central character, and later wrote Norse Mythology, his own retelling of the classic stories. Rick Riordan's Magnus Chase series brought Norse myths to young adult readers. The video games God of War and Assassin's Creed Valhalla have introduced millions to Norse cosmology and characters. These modern adaptations vary widely in their faithfulness to the source material. Some, like Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology, stay relatively close to the medieval texts. Others, like the Marvel films, use Norse mythology as a loose inspiration while telling fundamentally different stories. These adaptations have been criticized by some scholars and practitioners for inaccuracy, but they have undeniably brought Norse mythology to a global audience and sparked interest that has led many people to seek out the original sources. There has also been a religious revival. Asatru, which means faith in the Æsir, is a modern pagan movement that seeks to reconstruct or reimagine Norse polytheistic religion for the contemporary world. Practitioners build shrines, make offerings to the gods, celebrate festivals aligned with the old calendar, and seek to live according to values they draw from Norse sources. This movement is diverse, with some groups focusing on historical accuracy and others taking a more eclectic approach. The academic study of Norse mythology continues to evolve as well. Scholars analyze the texts from new angles, considering gender roles in the myths, examining how the myths reflect social structures of the Viking Age, comparing Norse myths to other Indo-European mythologies to trace common origins, and debating how much of what we have is genuinely pagan material versus Christian reinterpretation. What makes Norse mythology particularly resonant in the modern world? Perhaps it is the gods' mortality, the fact that they know they will die and yet continue fighting. In an age aware of climate change, nuclear weapons, and existential risks, myths about beings who face inevitable doom with courage rather than despair have particular relevance. Perhaps it is the complexity of characters like Odin and Loki, who defy simple categorization as good or evil. Or perhaps it is simply that these are powerful, well-crafted stories that speak to fundamental human experiences. The search for wisdom, the need for protection, the desires for love and prosperity, the attempt to create order in a chaotic universe, and the acceptance of mortality. The gods of Asgard have journeyed far from their origins in pre-Christian Scandinavia. They have survived conversion, preservation in manuscripts, centuries of obscurity, nationalist appropriation, and constant reinterpretation. Through it all, something essential has endured. Whether we encounter them in medieval poems or modern films, whether we see them as historical curiosities or living inspirations, Odin, Thor, Freyja, and their kin continue to captivate us with their struggles, their flaws, their courage, and their humanity. They remind us that even gods can be mortal, that even the mightiest must one day fall, and that what matters is not immortality, but how we live the time we have. The wheel continues to turn. The myths transform with each telling, yet remain recognizable. And somewhere in that transformation, in that continuity across centuries, perhaps we glimpse what the Norse themselves understood, that all things are cyclical, that endings are also beginnings, that death gives meaning to life, and that the stories we tell become the lens through which we understand ourselves and our world. Conclusion. Tonight we have journeyed through the 9 worlds suspended in the branches of Yggdrasil. We have witnessed the creation of the cosmos from ice and fire, walked among gods in golden Asgard and green Vanaheim, observed the war between divine tribes and their eventual alliance, and looked forward to the twilight of the gods and the rebirth that follows destruction. We have met Odin, the one-eyed wanderer who sacrificed everything for wisdom, who hung upon the world tree to learn the secrets of the runes, who gathered warriors in Valhalla, knowing they would fight and fall in a battle already foreseen. In him, we saw a god who understood that knowledge comes with terrible costs, that power requires sacrifice, and that sometimes the price must be paid, even when it cannot change the inevitable outcome. We encountered Thor, the thunder god with his mighty hammer Mjolnir, protector of gods and humans alike, standing watch against the forces of chaos every day. In his straightforward courage, his immense strength tempered with surprising moments of humiliation, his dedication to defending the innocent, we found a god who embodied the values of protection, reliability, and honest confrontation of threats. Thor did not scheme or manipulate. He faced his enemies directly, hammer in hand, and asked for nothing more than the chance to fight for what he believed worth defending. We explored the Æsir, that divine tribe of warrior gods who built halls and forged weapons, who valued law and hierarchy, sovereignty and honor. From Frigg's quiet knowing to Tyr's willing sacrifice, from Heimdall's eternal vigilance to Baldur's tragic beauty, each member of the Æsir contributed to the cosmic order they sought to maintain against the ever-present threat of chaos. We discovered the Vanir, gods of fertility and prosperity, masters of cider magic and the deep mysteries of life, death, and rebirth. Through Njord's connection to the wealth of the sea, Freyja's embodiment of peace and plenty, and Freyja's complex nature as goddess of both love and war, we saw a different understanding of divine power, one rooted in natural cycles and the magic that flows through all living things. We witnessed the war between these two divine families, a conflict that began with the burning of Gullveig and ended with an exchange of hostages that forever changed both tribes. From their union came Kvasir, the wisest being ever created, and from his blood the mead of poetry that would preserve their stories for generations to come. The Æsir Vanir war demonstrated that even among gods, conflict can give way to cooperation, that former enemies can become allies, and that diversity of perspective strengthens rather than weakens. And we have contemplated Ragnarök, that prophecy that hung over every moment of the gods' existence. We saw how the knowledge of their inevitable doom did not paralyze the gods with despair, but instead gave their actions meaning and weight. They knew winter would come, that bonds would break, that Fenrir and Jormungandr would break free, that fire and flood would consume the 9 worlds. They knew Odin would fall to the wolf, Thor would die from serpent venom, Freyr would be struck down by Surtur's flaming sword. They knew all this, and yet they continued. They stood guard, they built halls, they protected the innocent, they gathered warriors and told stories and lived as fully as immortal beings who knew their mortality could live. The Norse gods were not perfect. They made mistakes, gave in to jealousy and rage, broke oaths, and sometimes caused the very problems they later had to solve. Odin was manipulative. Thor could be deceived. Loki's tricks brought disaster. Freyja's desires led to conflict. But in their imperfection, they were more human than many other mythological pantheons. They showed us that even divine beings struggle with the same questions mortals face. How do we find meaning in a world where death is inevitable? How do we balance competing values and desires? How do we live with honor, when the cosmos itself seems indifferent to justice? How do we face our fate with courage rather than despair? The answers the Norse myths provide are not comforting in the way some religious traditions offer comfort. There is no promise of eternal paradise for the righteous, no assurance that good will ultimately triumph over evil, no guarantee that sacrifice will be rewarded or virtue recognized. Instead, there is only the knowledge that we are all, gods and mortals alike, caught in the turning of fate's wheel, and that what matters is not escaping that wheel, but conducting ourselves with honor while it turns. The Norse gods taught their worshippers to face life's hardships with stoic courage, to honor their oaths even when breaking them would be advantageous, to protect those weaker than themselves, to value wisdom alongside strength, to understand that death gives meaning to life rather than negating it. They showed that leadership requires sacrifice, that knowledge comes at a cost, that power brings responsibility, and that the greatest courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act rightly despite being afraid. These myths have survived the conversion to Christianity, the passage of centuries, the near loss of the manuscripts that preserved them, and countless retellings and reinterpretations. They have been studied by scholars, adapted by artists, distorted by ideologues, and rediscovered by new generations. Through all these transformations, something essential has remained: the power of stories about beings mightier than humans, but no more immune to fate, about a cosmos balanced between order and chaos, about the courage required to face an ending you cannot prevent. In our modern world, where ancient certainties have crumbled and we face challenges our ancestors could not have imagined, the Norse myths speak to us still. They remind us that civilizations, like gods, are mortal, that everything we build will one day fall, that the universe tends toward entropy and chaos, but they also remind us that from destruction comes new growth, that the earth rises green from the sea after the flames die down, that Lif and Lifthrasir emerge to begin again, that the surviving gods gather to remember and rebuild. Perhaps that is the greatest gift these myths offer us. Not false hope that we can avoid our fate, but true courage to face it well. Not the promise that everything will be fine, but the inspiration to make things as good as we can while we have the chance. Not the comfort of knowing we will live forever, but the dignity of making our brief time matter. The gods of Asgard knew they were mortal. They knew Ragnarök was coming. They knew they would fall. And every single day they got up anyway, put on their armor, took up their weapons, and stood watch over the cosmos they had sworn to protect. In that daily recommitment to duty despite knowing the ultimate outcome, in that refusal to surrender to despair even when despair would be logical, in that stubborn insistence on doing what was right even when right could not triumph, they showed us what it means to be truly heroic. So let us remember them. Odin the Wanderer, Thor the Protector, Freyja the Passionate, Freyr the Peaceful, Tyr the Just, Heimdall the Vigilant, and all the others who walked the halls of Asgard and Vanaheim. Let us remember their struggles and their triumphs, their flaws and their virtues, their lives and their foreseen deaths. Let us remember that they faced their twilight with weapons in hand and courage in their hearts, that they fought not because they could win, but because fighting was right, that they stood against chaos not because they could permanently defeat it, but because the temporary victories mattered. The gods may have fallen at Ragnarök, their halls burned and their thrones cast down, but their stories survived, carried forward by the skalds who drank the mead of poetry, preserved by medieval scholars who wrote them down, and kept alive by all of us who continue to tell them, to wonder at them, to find in them reflections of our own struggles and inspirations for our own courage. The wheel turns, the seasons change, winter follows summer and death follows life, and yet life returns again in spring. The Norse gods understood this cycle in their bones, lived it in their myths, and faced it in their prophesied end. They left us not answers but questions, not certainties but challenges, not comfort but the kind of courage that only comes from accepting mortality and choosing meaning anyway. And so our journey through the Norse cosmos comes to an end, though the myths themselves never truly end. They continue in every retelling, transform with each new generation, and live on wherever someone opens a book of mythology, watches a film inspired by these ancient stories, or simply looks up at the night sky and imagines the world tree holding all existence together, its roots in the depths and its branches in the heavens, enduring even as all things change. Thank you for joining me tonight on this journey through the realms of the Norse gods. If you enjoyed this exploration of Odin, Thor, the Vanir, and the Æsir, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Mythic Dreamscapes for more deep dives into the world's mythology, legends, and folklore. There are countless other pantheons to explore, other creation stories to witness, other heroes and monsters to meet, and I hope you'll join me for those journeys as well. Until next time, may your path be clear, your courage strong, and your stories worth telling. Good night.